Welcome to this Foundations for Heart Change video. If you really want to change, what does it take? That's been so much of what we're talking about, and today we're going to be talking about the new heart. So often in born-again circles, you get this idea of almost a magical transfer where you give your life to Christ and boom, everything is suddenly perfect and we're moving right down that road and we should never be able to look back. In fact, everything is just so made new, it's just working. Unfortunately, that doesn't fit reality. So often after we give our life to Christ, many times things actually blow up. They get worse because you hit spiritual warfare. You hit all kinds of different things and the challenges hit and my head is spinning and I'm trying to figure out what went wrong. Am I doing something wrong? At a simplistic level, there is this thing called spiritual presence, and we've been talking about that quite a bit, where you connect with God, and when His presence is on board, yes, it does feel like everything's made new. But there's other parts of your heart that are very solid, that are character, that are pieces that don't change quickly and don't change easily. And we end up bouncing back and forth. So this thing called heart change, it's not immediate. It takes work over a period of time. It's not totally simple. There's much to learn, and I hope that as you're listening to this video series, you're absorbing things that really do make a difference. Again, we're being joined today by Heather. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And Levi, are you all ready to go?
Ready to go.
Fired up?
Yep.
All right. Well, good. Well, I want to jump right into the first point where I talk about heart change requires an upgrade in the storehouse. Now, as always, that may sound a little bit
deep.
It may need to be unpacked a little bit, but let me start with Matthew 12, verse 35. And it says, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. And an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things." When you begin to study the heart, and we will actually cover some of this a few videos later, but when you begin to study the heart, I believe that your spirit begins functioning literally at conception, and you're already starting a recording process. So the heart has all of this stuff built up in what I'm calling a storehouse. It's interesting, in the temple, they actually had rooms where they stored things, where they had food, where they had all kinds of different things. So there was a biblical term for the storehouse. And the whole idea, and we, in our hearts, we begin storing things up early on. And this verse talks about it, says, "A good man out of the good treasure brings forth good. An evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil." Every one of us have a good heritage, a godly heritage, and every one of us have a bad heritage, an ungodly heritage. And there's a continual war going back and forth. And then you have the other piece, which is what we've been talking about in previous videos, where we're created to connect spiritually with God. So even if we're trying to access the good, even if we're wanting to choose the right thing, we can't do it without the grace of God, without the empowerment of God. So it's not just a matter of good and evil, it's also a matter of good and God, where I'm learning to connect with God. So you have many dynamics that are in play here. And all of that complexity that I just laid out there really takes us back to heart change requires an upgrade in the storehouse. So whatever's going on here, for me to get better, I've got to drink in from the outside. That's why we've done the videos that we've done so far. You take a look at the need to connect with God. That's primarily done what? Spiritually, where my spirit begins to connect with God. I learn to hear the voice of God. I learn to discern the difference between when it is God, when it's not God. I learn how to apply that voice. We've already been talking about this first point to some extent, that, oh, wow, I've got to get something new in the storehouse. Levi, as you think about your walk with God, what have been some of those pivotal moments where God literally poured into you in a way that brought changes in your storehouse?
I can think of the first Easter that I was at Crossroads Church. You were still pastoring. Billy, my wife, had made it to church that day. She got saved that Easter. But I can remember you praying over her and I in such a way that really invited the spiritual presence of God. And He poured love out on a way onto not only my wife, but onto my hard heart that enabled me to receive healing, enabled me to receive love from the people around me in a way that I wasn't previously capable of before. It was, I don't know, that jump start, that quickening of the heart that kind of brought me back to life in a way that, I don't know, allowed God to move in further ways in the future. But it was that initial, that love, that undeserving, here you are, I love you, that really brought me to life.
That's amazing, because if you think about everything we've been talking about, I've been saying over and over again, we can't get where we need to go, if we're not connected to God and receiving there. But we also need other believers. We need that worship time. We need to drink in, unless you get an upgrade in your storehouse. I like the word upgrade because we're all used to phones, and the phone that used to work a few years ago in the old technology, all of a sudden it no longer works because we've gone from 3G to 4G to 5G, and all of a sudden the programs, the apps that I'm putting on my phone, they require so much more memory, so much more capacity. The phone that used to work really well no longer works. That's such a picture of where we are spiritually, where we just need more. We need more Jesus. We need more right now touch from God in order to be able to do today the way God wants us to be able to do today. Heather, any thoughts in terms of this receiving area where God reached in and touched your life?
I like your upgrade analogy. I think it was yesterday or the day before, I had to accept to install the upgrade to the operating system on my phone. And that happens at periods when I'm not expecting it. There's no rhyme or reason to when it happens or how it happens. Just all of a sudden I get a notification and it's like, oh, okay, they've changed something, and it's kind of the perfect analogy, because my experience is that's exactly how God has operated with me. He, for decades, really, now I can see that he was doing it long before I even knew or would give him credit for even existing, honestly. But now I see that there have been these periods in my life when he's been like, time to install an upgrade. And so it's hard to really pinpoint one exact, except to say that it is really beautiful to me that it continues for our lifetime. I don't have to get to a place where I'm fully as good as I'm going to get in this world. And what I mean by good is connected, peaceful, joyful, happy, healthy. He's constantly upgrading what's happening with me. Sometimes I've got to admit it can be exhausting. I can be like, can I just have a little moment here? But when I get to those plateaus, inevitably, I want more. And I get to a place where I'm kind of a dry season, and it feels boring, honestly. And so he gives me what I what I need when I need it. That's for sure.
I love what you talked about, how Jesus does that. The Father does that outside of our awareness, outside of even sometimes our seeking. John 6:44, no man can come to the Father unless what? The Father draws us to him. And so a lot of times we look at this process and it's like, oh, I've got to work really, really hard. Another point that I want to make here to bring across, I almost titled this section Invisible Seeds, because that's such an incredible point. When you look at the sower and the seed, Jesus literally talks about, hey, we're on the path, we're out sowing seeds. A lot of times in the ministry, I talk about that, where we sow seed, we do teachings, we love on people, we get burned by people. And at some point, people get really frustrated, and I'm like, no, we're sowing seed. That's our job. And God is doing the same thing. He's got our heart, and he's sowing seeds. And that's what you were talking about fits so well into that, where God's sowing these seeds down into you. And it literally takes sometimes months, years before they really begin to take root and take a hold. But it's neat that this isn't just a me process. This is a God and me process. And we've learned about that already, but that's so incredibly powerful. And Hebrews 11 talks about God is invisible, but the invisible God created everything we see and hear. In the same way, when God begins to move in us, in each one of us, There's an invisible download that begins to do this work. And it may be much later in this process that we're going to talk about before we kind of have that aha moment where it's like, oh, now I see, now I understand. But there is that starting point, the new heart, the new creation, where we connect with God. We begin to tangibly connect with God at a much higher level. And again, that goes back to spirit, and recognizing His voice. And all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, there is a living God, and I'm in communion with Him. And that's an amazing life. The next point is that heart change requires a cleaning of the spiritual filters. And we've already talked about this again a little bit in the idea that wherever your spirit is, it already sets up this filter. If I'm in a bad mood, it sets up this thing of, all right, now I'm interpreting you from inside of that bad mood or inside of the offense or the anger or whatever. What are my chances of getting heart change if my filter isn't cleaned up? And so the receiving piece is incredibly powerful. And there are things, obviously, that are painful to us. And I love Jesus' words where He says, look, be careful what you hear. Well, to some extent, you have no control over what you hear, seemingly. I'm in your presence, you're speaking. What am I supposed to do? Tackle you and shut you up? But that's not what He's talking about. You respond according to how you hear. Let me change the language. According to those filters. And where I am spiritually is huge in terms of how I'm interacting with life. And we don't even think about that. We just believe that we're hearing truth. We believe we're objective when that just isn't the truth. We need to clean up some spiritual filters. Levi, any thoughts about filters?
I have a really awesome, blessed life, as long as my perspective is that. Occasionally, Satan comes at me and I get focused on the stress. I get focused on the seemingly failures in relationship and others' sobriety and ministry and stuff like that. And I start focusing on the need and focusing on the stress and stop seeing my life as a blessing. And when I stop seeing my life and those around me as a blessing, when my perspective gets that my life is a curse, that I have to do all of these things, that God has not blessed me overwhelmingly. It's the same life, but from a negative perspective. And if my perspective gets into that of God is not moving in mighty ways, it's crushing. I can't do this job without that connection from God. And also that perspective of God is moving, God is blessing, God is covering. It's pertinent to what I do.
When I got here, the concept of filters was really new for me. I mean, on the surface, I kind of got it, that if I don't forgive people, for example, I'm going to be skeptical of people. If I stay in a place of victimhood, then I'm going to continue to be victimized. Those kind of things I had gleaned from self-help and 12 steps and all the other many things that I was doing to try to fix myself. But the idea of what you talk about, spiritual flows, and my filter being, what always comes to me is that my filter's clogged, and things aren't getting through the way that they're intended from the people around me and from God. So it's kind of taken me deeper in that understanding that maybe my thoughts and my perceptions are not necessarily reliable, because I may be in a place where I'm seeing through a lens or I'm receiving through a filter of being a victim or being a martyr or, whatever, being self-righteous, being like all these different. The devil is a shapeshifter. And he's constantly, I feel like one filter gets removed and he's like, yeah, here's another one, like, woo, like an evil
Check
villain,
this out.
And with the spiritual presence piece, that can change within a millisecond. You can literally go from one point, loving someone and thinking, wow, this is great, to highly offended and angry, and the filter can shift so quickly. And that's the spiritual piece that a lot of times people don't understand. There's also a practical piece to this one, and I remember this one. I remember when I was dating my current wife. And at that point, I was hearing this song about cheating and relationships and all of that. And all of a sudden, these thoughts started coming into my brain. And it hit me. It's like, why am I listening to this music? This music is literally creating distrust and suspicion. And so a lot of times the filter actually can be not this subconscious spiritual thing. It needs to be intentional. And if it's garbage in, it's going to be garbage out. And so we need to learn to actively filter at a practical level. Now, Heather, you were talking about a point that I'm going to lead into the next one, which is heart change requires new messages being sent and received. Especially in addiction, one of the number one things is victim mentality. Life has done this to me, and especially the generations that are living now, it's more and more, it's my parents' fault, it's society's fault, and we're living more and more in a victim world. I love to go back to Luke 6:38, where it says, give and it shall be given unto you, pressed down, shaken together. I mean, that's a picture of the old measurement where you could just pour it in a little bit. No, we're going to pour it in, and we're going to get an abundant overflow. You're going to get a blessing back. Shall men pour into your bosom? I mean, this is incredibly powerful. You can look at that as just the law of sowing and reaping, and it's just going to happen. But this verse talks about what you give out is going to come back to you. And let me take it one step farther, and that's part of the reason that works is we're all made in the image of God. So what I'm giving out, people in general will tend to respond to me the way God would respond to me. That's just kind of a generic. Are there individuals that will respond very differently? The answer is yes. So you'll have a particular person that you triggered, which is obviously spiritual language, and they have this explosion because of what's going on inside of them, and they treat you very differently than how you treat them. But there's also a catch on this one that a lot of times people don't see. They don't see and understand the power of the spiritual realm. Ephesians 3:23 talks about be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And from that language, I talk about every word you say, every action you take has a spiritual tag. So when I'm giving to you, Levi, I may be judging you, and that may be going on. I may think I'm superior to you. And there's all kinds of things like that, but I'm a skilled communicator. So I'm very careful with my words, and I'm walking through my words, and I'm walking through all of that to try to make sure that I'm not doing any of that stuff. And again, this is what our world thinks about. It thinks only about the natural realm. And I run into so many kids as an educator. When I was a principal, I'd have kids that would be, she's picking on me, he's picking on me. And I basically said, look, the reason they pick on you is because it's fun. And the reason it's fun is because you get upset. And so they'd come back to me after a week and they'd say, I haven't responded, they're still picking on me. And I go back to there's a spiritual realm. We sense things. So we're sending messages, and that's a powerful word that we don't even realize we're sending. And when you take the totality, not just of your words and your actions, but your messages, the totality of what you're sending, this verse very clearly says, give, and it shall be given unto you. Now, you can't be a victim at that point. You cannot be a victim. If you believe in this principle, you can't be a victim. At some point, you've got to step back and realize, if my life's a mess, I need to be able to send different messages. I need to change the filters so that I'm receiving different messages. I'm not getting offended. I mean, this is an incredible concept, especially in the area of addiction, but really for anybody.
Sometimes it's hard to accept or to confront and let someone see, hey, you're just receiving what you ordered. You're getting back what you put out. It's kind of hard sometimes to put that. But once that law of sowing and reaping really started to make sense in my life and in my heart, and I could see it happening in my past, it became an empowering sort of thing, because the world and its people are wicked. It's evil. It's an awful place. I mean, that's just a fact. But if I have to wait for the world to change in order to have any satisfaction, any joy, any success, any peace in my life, I am going to be waiting forever. So the gift in being able to take ownership of, you know what? Yeah, I put that out there. My fault, my mistake. That's what I did. That's the order I placed. And that's what I received when the waitress brought my order. Really turns into a gift of being able to see that I'm not a victim of just what the world is giving me. It just always felt like life was happening to me or at me. And that's an awful, you were talking about that's the way the world is operating. It's a horrible place to be. It's terrible.
A lot of my life had a general cockiness and arrogance about me, just an air that people didn't really like, and I didn't get it, nor could I see it. I just had repeated bad interactions with most people, and I couldn't figure out why people didn't like me. And it took a real humbling of myself and introspect to see that, hey, you're a jerk, and you give off a message of you're a jerk, and that's why people don't like you. It was relatively simple once I could see, hey, this is what you're doing, and just dial that back a little bit and have far better relationships.
You know, Pastor, you started out talking about in the beginning of the video about when we come to Jesus, we think everything's going to get good. But often it's the opposite that happens. And this is one area where I really started to see that. And it freaked me out. I didn't understand what spiritual warfare was. I didn't understand where it was coming from. My life prior to coming to Christ was a much shinier, happier place. That's just the truth. And when I came to Christ, it shifted. So to be realistic, I mean, the truth is I offend a lot more people now as a Christian than I ever did when I wasn't. The world is offended by us. And Jesus says that. If they hated me, how much more will they hate you? They hated all the prophets. That's why he says, count it joy when you experience all of this. So I think it's important to recognize too, that just because I'm living as Christ asked me to live, because I'm living a godly life, the devil's going to come after me even more. And how does he do that? He uses other people to and weaponizes other people to come against me. So it's not, I can also get into a place of thinking if I'm just kind to everyone, if I love my neighbor as myself, they're going to love me back. And that's not realistic.
When we walk where Christ walked, it actually creates conviction to other people. And sometimes rather than feel convicted, rather than want to change, they're going to attack us. So that's totally accurate. And that is one of the outcomes that you can see. In my life, it really parallels what Levi was talking about. I wrote books. I was deeply into discipleship. I counseled all kinds of people. And so often when they would come, I felt like I could see things. And frankly, I do believe I did see things. But there was that sense of, I know, you don't, listen to me. There was more of that stuff going on in me that was helping create some of these outcomes, helping create some of these responses. When I got into the Omega Project, and all of a sudden I was able to look at addicts and realize, I don't know how to help these people. I took an ownership of their lives. Initially, it wasn't healthy. It was actually more controlling, manipulative, whatever, because I believed I should be able to help them. But as time went on and I began to realize I don't have what I need, that humility that woke up, all of a sudden people could hear me at a completely different level. And this is so important in this area. Give and it shall be given unto you. It really is a powerful point. Next point that we talk about is heart change requires a new worldview. And frankly, if you really want to get back to biblical language, I'm going to call it beliefs. Just like there are beliefs, there are belief systems, even in our bodies. We have a respiratory system. We have a circulatory system. We have a digestive system. You have all kinds of different pieces that fit together. And eventually, for us to get to a healthy place, we've got to go back to the previous points where We change filters into consistent filters, if you will, consistent outlooks, where we're looking at the world in a way that actually is biblical. Because if you're bringing some of your old beliefs, if you're bringing some of your old ideas into the mix, it's going to be virtually impossible to keep those filters clean. It's going to be virtually impossible to send good messages, to receive good messages. At some point, you kind of need to use your brain a little bit and sort through this thing and read the Word of God and begin to understand, oh, do my ideas match up with God? And I'm going to actively change my thinking toward what God would require.
One of my big belief systems, worldviews that God has been consistently working on, since I initially started walking with him, is I believe I have to be punished to be corrected in pretty much all circumstances. That God has to come and do something really harsh and over the top. Never once have I found God's correction to be harsh and over the top. I'll know that I'm doing something that God kind of wants me to stop doing, and have in my head that, okay, when God moves me from where I'm at to a place where I can stop doing this, it's going to come with a harsh punishment. And never once has it happened that way. And I don't know if that's just because of my particular heart that God responds to me in that way to minister things at a softer way to try to curb that negative belief in punishment.
If you jump back to a previous video where we talked about the voice of God and how he works, most of the time it starts with a gentle pressure that just increases over a period of time. If I am being obstinate, stubborn, rebellious over a period of time, the punishments can and do get harder and even harsher from time to time. But that's not the norm. That's not who God is. That's not how he operates. He works through it over a period of time. He's very patient. He's very gentle. That's what people don't see about the Old Testament. They don't see the warning, 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 another warning. Okay, now the judgment.
God is a good father. He wants to correct us. He wants to come alongside us and guide us in a way, but he has to correct us. I'm thankful for addiction, that it brought my heart to a place of humility, and maybe even a lifestyle of humility. I think I'm moving there. At least that's where I'm going, I believe.
We really do have to step back, take a look at the larger picture. That's why you study. That's why you sit down with other people. You interact with other people. You learn to see from different points of view, and you develop a biblical worldview. You develop an outlook that's going to allow you to consistently do this heart change thing in a positive way. The next point is heart change requires an overcoming response to, again, a very spiritual word in my opinion, triggers. As a spiritual being, there are spiritual knives, spiritual arrows that are going to come in, and they're going to hit wounded spots. And when they hit wounded spots, you're going to scream because it hurts. And so those triggers create the instantaneous reactions. And many times in those instantaneous reactions, we know that we're not doing what we should do, but we're just relatively powerless to handle it. Well, over a period of time, if you start growing up the heart, you change the belief systems, you do all the things that we're talking about, you receive healing, you get nurture, the power of those triggers should get less and less, and your ability to overcome should become more and more. One line that I have that I just love, and again, it's simple, but it's change isn't change until it's change. And back to, we're born again, and all of a sudden we feel these things because we've got spiritual presence on board, and we're like, okay, everything's done now, everything's changed now. No, change isn't change until it's changed. And you don't know if it's change until you get triggered. And when triggered, you're either able to bring it under control in a way that, wow, I wasn't totally grotesque. Well, that's a good first step. The next time it's like, wow, I was able to step back and think about what God would want me to think. I was able to quote some scriptures. I pulled it back into line. And then I get to the final step, which is just really amazing. all of a sudden something just comes out of you that is a God thing. And you're like, whoa, I got provoked. I got triggered and God showed up. I didn't have the ugly stuff show up. That's when you know, wow, we're getting to an amazing place.
You can't get healing from a distance. I'm thinking about my last season, and my last season was difficult. It was, my relationship with God was strained. My relationship with the people around me was strained. I went through a season where a lot of my spiritual triggers were really popping. I feel like God used that to heal my heart and soul from a lot of that childhood stuff, a lot of them wounds that I'd gone through in life that were still kind of hanging out there, kind of unattended, kind of swept under the rug. But as those triggers were coming up, God used that and used the relationships to really change my heart.
The next point, which really ties in, heart change requires a cleansing, healing process. If you don't get the cleansing, if you don't get the healing, there's really no ability for those triggers not to impact you. I mean, they're there. If there's pain there, when you don't respond to pain, if you touch a hot stove and you don't know it's hot, that's not a good thing. So if there's stuff still there, you need to respond to triggers. You need to obviously, hopefully, if you're trying to be godly, dial that back so I'm not responding and going off like a wild man. I'm bringing it back under control. But a lot of times people feel guilty for the trigger response. And I'm saying, no, you need that trigger response. You need that time of awakening so that you're like, oh, stove is hot. Need to not touch stove. Now I have identified something is going on. The cleansing, healing process then takes that and it begins to understand the deeper parts of that. And the deeper parts, you can only be hurt by what you care about. So something along the way I've cared about very deeply, I've been violated, it comes back into me in a way that feels very personal. And now I have a trigger that is what? It's personal. It's not surrendered to God. It's not surrendered to the good of the people around me. So now I've got this area that's really a me thing, and I'm going to respond badly. I'm going to hurt people. I'm going to yell. I'm going to scream, whatever. When those things show up, obviously the first step is just dial it back. Get it under a reasonable control so that I'm not being a total jerk. As I talked about that, that's step one. At some point, I begin to catch it and I don't have to make a bad response. And then the third step that I talked about is the instinctive. But here, when it shows up, don't expect yourself to have it right immediately. This is what heart change looks like. If it don't show up, you won't grow up. It's a part of the process. We're seeing these things. When we see them, instead of being shocked of, oh no, I'm a terrible person. No, that's kind of been true all along. You are selfish, egoistic, and all of the different things. You just kind of became aware of it. So take a deep breath now and begin to cooperate with God in a way that you actually start getting better.
You know, I'm thinking about how the modern culture has grabbed onto that word triggers. And I've seen things posted on Facebook, for example, that are like, your triggers are your responsibility. And there's like this almost victim shaming, victim blaming thing. You need to get your stuff under control and all that kind of stuff. And certainly I don't think we have to tiptoe around, but I can definitely do well to remind myself that when I'm seeing an out of the norm reaction or behavior in someone, or even over a period of time where they just don't seem to be themselves, that God's doing something in them right now. And same is true for me. It's just easier for me to give that compassion to somebody that's not me, honestly, because when I'm going through it, I have all kinds of voices that I need to get myself together and I need to act different. But a trigger, to me, what I picture is a bear trap, like laying underneath grass or leaves or whatever in a forest, and I'm just walking through and snap, it snatches me. And of course, my reaction is going to be to grab my leg and scream. You know, that's the natural reaction. And the same is going to be true for someone else. So to have some compassion and understanding, wow, when somebody's acting out of their pain, when they're acting out and maybe their pain doesn't show up the way somebody else's does. A lot of times I've recognized being here that when someone is obviously in emotional pain, and what I mean by that is they're weeping, they're crying, they're vulnerable and depressed, we're much quicker to be compassionate and loving on them, and we'll pray over them and all that kind of stuff. But when somebody's angry and they're wanting to throw things, or they're not showing up, or they're cussing people out, or like whatever, the same response is necessary because it's the same thing happening. It is a trigger, and it's just showing up in a different way. Some people, when that bear trap hits them, are going to fall on the floor like a 3-year-old and cry, "I'm hurting, somebody help me." Somebody else is going to get down there and try to pull it apart with their bare hands and cuss it out, But it's no less a trigger. It's no less a trap. So to be a little more compassionate with one another and with ourselves, to recognize that I'm going to step on these things, and they're going to show up, and it's going to show up in other people too.
The way I always picture a trigger is, in a movie where somebody gets wounded and then they cover it up and it later comes to the detriment of the group. That's how I always picture a trigger, is like a wound that's been somewhat hidden and later will come up and be exposed in some way that'll be harmful to everybody involved.
This is a concept that we'll do an entire video over, but it's called file drawers. And whenever I see someone responding out of proportion, I look at them and I say, okay, your response does not equal what happened to you. Now we're talking a trigger. There's a spiritual equivalency that was created, and there's a wound, and not just a wound. It's a wound that connected you to maybe even generations of wounds over a period of years. And so, of course, when you factor in the spiritual realm, what happens? That means now I'm responding at this incredibly high level, because I'm not responding to one situation. I'm responding to 10, 20, 50, hundreds, maybe even thousands of situations. Of course, I'm having an inordinate response.
Maybe not just my lifetime of that pain, but maybe also my near ancestors that have also dealt with that very same spiritual junk, pain coming down on me.
In Dead Dogs on the Highway, Overcoming the Stench of Unforgiveness, I actually detail that. I detail my grandfather's pain, which then passed into my mother, which then passed into me, which now I'm dealing with it with my son. And when you get things that are beyond one generation, they actually can go very deep. And that's a great point, and thank you for making that. The final point is heart change requires maturing. I believe in arrested development. So just because I go back and I get healing, I've still got, in some cases, a 3-year-old. Many times we're looking out there and I'm seeing 3-year-old behavior. What's going on? Well, they got triggered. When they got triggered, they manifest 3-year-old behavior. Why? Because of arrested development. They were traumatized at age 3. So you can go back and you can pray over that wound and you can walk all of that through. Guess what? You still have a 3-year-old. So there's a period of time that you have to walk with this individual and help them grow up, help them mature. And many times, again, we treat it as like magical. It's like, okay, you walk through a forgiveness process, everything should be okay now. You should all be good. And the answer is no. Heart change means that not only do I get rid of the pain, not only do I get rid of the wound, which you go through obviously in a forgiveness process, and I'm going to encourage you, check out the video series, Let It Go. It talks about all of that, letting go of wounds and stuff in a very great detail. But you can do all of that and not get heart change. Somewhere along the line, you need to put on Christ. You need to grow up into maturity. We need to work together. It needs to stop being about me. It needs to become about us. It needs to become about the kingdom. And if there's anything that I would see in Christian culture today, it's a me gospel instead of a we gospel. There's not going to be maturity in that. And so until we get outside of ourselves and begin to put on some maturity where I'm an adult now, oh, the kid has needs, I'm going to take care of the kid. My needs don't matter right now. They can wait till later. That's not the kind of Christianity that I see being preached, and we need to have a Christianity that encourages people to grow up into adults, grow into maturity. Heather, as you look at your time here in the program, where would you identify that, wow, here's where I really grew, here's where I really matured?
There have been many that have happened over the course of the last 18 months. Some significant experiences, things coming up. Well, very early on, you were talking about forgiveness and the Dead Dogs material. And right before, God, his timing is just so perfect. Couldn't have anticipated that this was going to happen when it did. But the day before we were starting the Dead Dogs intensive weekend, we were sitting in class. Oh, well, it must have been Thursday. So it was the day before. We were going to do that on Friday. And pastor said the word shame. He wasn't even he was sharing something about a phone call he'd had, and the word shame came out of his mouth, and tears just started pouring out of my face, and I couldn't stop them from coming. And that was the first time that someone had prayed out loud over me in a group ever before. So there was a level of vulnerability there that was new for me. My walk with God has been very solitary and very private and very much just mine. And so sharing that level of vulnerability and allowing other people to see me pray and be prayed over was big. And I think that was the kickoff for what was going to happen over the next 18 months for sure. But that prayer that we said then, in that, I remember you saying the word rejection, which I had never considered. And because I always thought I was so tough. I just leave. You can't reject me. I'm gone. But it was, but I didn't realize that it was a preemptive strike kind of thing. I'll break up with you before you can break up with me. But it was just really, a telling experience for me to go, wow, the Holy Spirit is working right now on me right here. You pulled out I was dealing with being estranged from my children and then being upset with me. And that's what I thought I wanted to pray about or needed to pray about. But it turned out, talking about generations, that it came from my mom and dad and this shame for my very core being, and needing to forgive them, and asking God to forgive me for not forgiving them. So, it was kind of like reading the back of the book in the bookstore. It's like, here's everything you're going to deal with while you're here. And I couldn't have told you that then. But 18 months later, I can see how that one moment, that one prayer, God has been taking me through the inside of the book since I've been here and revealing these things about rejection, about forgiveness, about the patterns with my family, the breaking those generational curses and words that were spoken over me. And it's pretty cool how that happened.
I love what you said about private religion, because private religion and maturity, they're like enemies. Until you opened up, until you were able to share with other people, allow other people to pray with you, that's what the maturing process looks like. You learn to see the greater good. You learn to see a bigger picture. When the picture's all about me, I'm not very mature. But when I'm able to get beyond me, when I'm able to get into a place where now I'm seeing God, I'm seeing the purposes of God, the glory of God, I'm seeing other people, I'm seeing their needs, I'm putting their needs above my own. That's what maturity looks like. And when that begins to happen, that's incredibly powerful. I want to make one final comment. It's not a clean point that we're detailing in the outline. But a lot of times when people talk about spirituality, they separate the spiritual from the natural. And there's a principle that we've already taught on in the video series that I call alignment, where until the spiritual is expressed through the natural, it doesn't have authority, it doesn't have power. So when I'm talking about, forgiveness and shame and rejection, there are words, there are actions, there is a heart change. Change isn't change until it's change. There are things that need to happen in the natural realm And until those things are happening in the natural realm, we're not done yet. And there's a whole group of people out there that walk around and they feel incredibly spiritual, but they're into head knowledge. They're into kinds of things that just don't impact the practical life. That's not maturity. You get into maturity when the words, the actions, the thoughts, your spirit, all of that, as it's coming into alignment in Christ, now I'm coming into a place of maturity. And that takes a long time to get there. That's the part where, again, people want to right here, right now, it's all done. I sure haven't experienced that. I'm still finding where I am, there's a lot of warfare. Life can be a fight. It's hard to humble myself. All of those things are still true in my life. But I also can look back and I can see where I was. I can see where I am. I can see the growth. And because I can see that growth, I can look forward and go, okay, I'm sure there's still blind spots. And someday I'll grow through those blind spots. And after I grow through those, I'll be able to look back and see where God has brought me. I mean, that's just a beautiful picture of what life in Christ should look like. Again, we want to thank you for joining this video. This one was designed to give you more of that overview of the steps. We've been walking you through the steps of heart change, but it was good to just pause and say, oh, wow, let's just get a good look at the entire journey. The next videos will detail some of these concepts even more. We'll be talking about belief systems and other kinds of things that will just help you open up what's going on inside in a way that you can get that heart change. You can get that walk with God. You can be mature and a life giver to the people around you. I hope you'll continue to join us on this Foundations for Heart Change series.